I once worked with an organization that was about to get hit with a $20,000 workers' compensation audit bill, and I got it down to $2,000. Now, that wasn't about luck. It came down to a few very specific pieces of information that the insured didn't know and they almost missed. So, here's something that a lot of business owners don't realize. Nothing about your business can change. You can have the same employees and the same work and the same payroll, but still end up with a bad audit if it's not presented correctly. And so that's why this matters a lot, because your workers' comp audit isn't just paperwork. It's one of the biggest opportunities you have to either lose money or keep it. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to avoid paying for subcontractors that shouldn't be your responsibility, how to make sure your employees are classified correctly so you're not overpaying, and some of the simple mistakes in your audit paperwork that can cost you thousands of dollars if you don't catch them. So, going back to that $20,000 audit, the reason it got that high wasn't because they were doing anything shady. It was because of how some information was presented and what they couldn't prove. So, we fixed a few things in that audit. It was classifying of certain employees, documentation about subcontractors, and then when we explained to the auditor that the employees were not social service employees, they were working in an outpatient mental health clinic, that number dropped to $2,000. So it was the same business with the same work, but a completely different outcome. So the question is, where does that extra $18,000 come from in the first place? So let me answer that question. Where does it come from? It actually comes from how the audit actually works. See, at the beginning of your year, your workers' comp policy is based on an estimate, how much payroll you think you're going to have, how your employees are classified, and what your business is doing. But at the end of the year, the insurance company comes back and says, okay, let's take a look at what actually happened. And that's what the audit is. So it's not random or arbitrary, it's a reconciliation. What they're going to do is look at your payroll, your employees, your subcontractor, and all the documentation that supports it. So here's the key. If something isn't clearly documented or proven, it usually gets counted in a way that costs you more money. So let's start with one of the biggest and most expensive mistakes I see, and it's where a lot of surprise bills come from. Insured subcontractors. If you can't prove they have their own workers' comp coverage, you're going to end up paying for them. I see this all the time with all kinds of businesses. A business will hire a subcontractor or an independent contractor. They will think that they're not responsible for them or assume that they're covered. Maybe they even had a conversation about it. But when the audit comes around, if there's no certificate of insurance to back it up, in the auditor's eyes, that subcontractor now has the same exposure as one of your employees, which means that payroll is going to get pulled into your policy and your costs are going to go up. So the fix here is simple, but you have to be very disciplined about it. Every subcontractor or independent contractor you work with should have their own workers' comp policy. And more importantly, you need to have proof of it, a current certificate of insurance on file, ready to go, because at audit time, it doesn't matter what you remember, it matters what you can show. So the rule to follow is this: no certificate means they're an employee in your auditor's eyes. And that's a mistake that can get expensive fast. Now, even if you get that right, there's another place where businesses quietly overpay, and it has to do with how your employees are classified. So this is one of the places where I've seen some of the biggest swings in audit costs. I even alluded to it earlier. It comes down to how your employees are classified, because in workers' comp, not all payroll is treated the same. Every employee is assigned a class code based on the type of work they do, and each of those codes has a different rate. And a higher risk work is going to get a higher rate. Lower risk work is a lower rate. So if your employees are placed in a higher rated class code than they should be, you're going to pay more. It's that simple. And this is exactly what was happening in the $20,000 audit. I was working with a children's home that opened an outpatient mental health clinic. They had contractors working in that clinic. And when the audit came through, those workers were being treated in a way that drove the cost up around $20,000. Now, nothing about the work was actually extreme or high risk. Outpatient mental health is like a doctor's office, but the way it was being interpreted and classified made it very expensive. It was being put into a social services class code. So I had stepped in and had a conversation with the auditor, and I talked through what it actually looked like day to day. I brought out the definition of the class code. We clarified the rules, and we were able to agree on a classification that better matched what was happening, more in line with the doctor's office. And that brought the audit cost down to around $2,000. So it was the same people and the same work. We just got it classified differently and correctly for that matter. And so here's another part that business owners miss. If you have employees doing multiple types of work or work that isn't clearly defined, the auditor is usually going to assign that employee to the classification that best represents their overall duties. And in the end, a lot of times it's the highest cost classification. It's not because they're trying to hurt you, but it's because based on what they see, that's the most defensible option. So, what can you do about it? First, make sure your employees are actually classified correctly based on what they do to day, not just what their job title says. Second, be very clear in how those roles are described and presented during the audit. The more clearly you can explain the actual work being performed, the better chance you have of landing in the right classification. Because if the work isn't clearly defined, you're probably going to get assigned to the most expensive version of it. So, just like with subcontractors, the rule here is simple. If you can't clearly show what the work looks like, you're probably going to pay for the most expensive interpretation of it. And that brings us to the next place where even well run businesses lose money, and it has everything to do with how your paperwork tells the story. So here is one where even organized businesses lose money because the audit isn't about what just happened. It's about what you can prove happened. And if your paperwork doesn't clearly tell that story, the auditor is going to fill in the gaps. And when they fill in the gaps, it's usually not in your favor. So I've seen this happen with businesses that thought they had everything under control. They send over payroll reports, bank statements, maybe a few notes, but nothing is clearly broken out. So now the auditor is trying to sit there and figure out what happened. And when something isn't clearly defined, whether it's payroll, reimbursements, or overtime, it can get treated in a way that increases your costs. For example, overtime. There's a portion of overtime that doesn't typically count towards your workers' comp premium, but only if it's clearly tracked and separated. If it's all just lumped together as total payroll, you can miss that benefit completely. Same with reimbursements, mileage, per diem travel. Those things aren't automatically excluded. If they're not clearly documented and separated, they can get pulled into the payroll during an audit. And now you're paying premium on money that shouldn't even be included. So the goal here isn't just to have records, it's to have clean, organized, easy to follow records, payroll that's clearly reported, contractors separated from employees, anything that shouldn't be counted clearly shown as its own category. Because at the end of the day, the auditor is working with what you give them. And if your records are messy or unclear, you're giving them a version of the story that usually costs you more. So the rule here is simple. If your paperwork doesn't clearly tell the story, the auditor will. And that's not a position you want to be in. Now, and this last one doesn't get talked about much, but it can turn a manageable audit into something a lot more expensive and has nothing to do with your payroll or classifications. It's doing the paperwork and the timing of it. See, when an audit comes in, you're going to get requests for information, reports, contractor details, and documentation. A lot of business owners push it off. They're busy and it's not urgent. They'll get to it later. But here's the problem. The audit doesn't just sit there forever. If you don't respond or you take too long, the insurance company can move forward without your full information. And when that happens, they're going to estimate. And just like everything else we've talked about, those estimates are usually not in your favor. So now, instead of a clean, accurate audit, you're dealing with inflated numbers or even penalties just because the process dragged out. So the fix here is simple. When the audit comes in, handle it quickly. Get the documents together, send them in. And if you need more time, communicate that early because a slow response almost always leads to expensive assumptions. So the rule here is the longer you wait, the more control you give up over the outcome. So if you go back to that $20,000 audit that turned into $2,000, it wasn't because anything about the business changed. It came down to a few things. One, making sure subcontractors were handled correctly. Two, making sure the classifications matched the actual work. And three, making sure the paperwork clearly told the story and making sure the process didn't drag out. It was the same business with the same people and the same work, but a completely different outcome. So when you look at your next workers' comp audit, don't think of it as just paperwork you have to get through. It's one of the biggest opportunities you have to control your costs. And if you get these few things right, you can keep a lot more of that money where it belongs, in your pocket. Now, if you're thinking about subcontractors right now, because that's where a lot of people get tripped up, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, well, they're 1099, so they're not my problem. And it's this assumption that is exactly what gets people into big audit bills. So if you want to understand why 1099 versus W 2 doesn't actually matter to workers' comp auditors and what rules they're really using to decide whether you pay for someone or not, click right here and watch this next video on 1099 versus W 2, the workers' compensation cost trap.